The little boy asked, "Will you stay, princess?" And the Duke answered, "She's not going anywhere." She was kneeling in the mud when the child's fever broke, her silk gown ruined beyond repair, her hands trembling as she pressed a cool cloth to his burning forehead. And that was when the Duke of Ashbourne found her, this fallen princess who'd once refused his marriage proposal in front of 300 guests, now weeping with relief over a stable boy's son as if he were her own flesh and blood. He stood in the doorway of the servant's cottage, rain streaming from his greatcoat, watching the woman who'd humiliated him publicly now humbling herself privately, and something in his chest that had been frozen for 2 years began, against all reason, to thaw. Wait, before the next confession unfolds. If this story has already stirred your heart, tell us where you're watching from. To make sure you don't miss the next betrayal, kiss, or redemption, subscribe and join our circle. The next heartbeat might change everything. Now, back to the scene. Princess Celeste Marguerite of Valmont had not meant to fall so far, so fast. 6 months ago, she'd been the jewel of 3 kingdoms, courted by emperors and fawned over by poets. Now she was a governess in Yorkshire, employed under a false name by a minor baronet who needed someone to teach his daughters French and deportment. She'd taken the position out of desperation, after her father's gambling debts had consumed their estate and her engagement to the Crown Prince of Bavaria had been dissolved with a terseness that still stung her pride. But it wasn't the prince she thought of as she wrung out the cloth and whispered prayers in her native tongue. It was the boy, little Thomas, 8 years old, son of the head groom, who'd brought her wildflowers every morning for a week, who'd asked her, in his Yorkshire accent she'd grown to love, if princesses ever got lonely. Who'd reminded her that before the titles and the silk and the shame, she'd wanted to be useful, to matter beyond her bloodline. Is he breathing easier? The voice came from behind her, deep and controlled, and Celeste froze. She knew that voice. It had haunted her dreams with accusations she couldn't answer. Slowly, she turned. Alexander Grayson, Duke of Ashbourne, stood silhouetted against a lamp-lit doorway, taller than she remembered. His dark hair swept back from a face that seemed carved from the same granite as his ancestral estate. He was 32, unmarried by choice after her refusal, and the most powerful landowner in the north of England. This estate, the modest property where she'd found refuge, belonged to his cousin. He'd found her. "Your Grace," she whispered, rising on unsteady legs. Her governess's dress was plain gray wool, now soaked and mud-stained. Her golden hair, once styled by 3 ladies' maids, hung in a simple braid down her back. She must look like a ghost of the woman who'd stood before him 2 years ago in the Crystal Palace and said, with a smile that had cost her everything, "I'm afraid I cannot marry a man I do not love, Your Grace, no matter how distinguished his title." The scandal had been immediate and absolute, but she'd been a princess then, protected by her father's name and her mother's diplomatic connections. She'd believed herself untouchable. How wrong she'd been. "Miss Marguerite," he said, using the surname she'd chosen for her disguise. His gray eyes swept over her, taking in every detail. "Or should I say, Your Highness?" "There is no highness anymore." Celeste lifted her chin, finding some remnant of the pride that had defined her. "My father is dead, Your Grace. The Principality of Valmont was absorbed into the French Empire 3 months ago. I am no one of consequence. You're in my cousin's employ. I am a governess, nothing more. A governess who tends to sick children in the middle of the night." He stepped into the cottage, closing the door against the storm. In the small space, he seemed even larger, more overwhelming. When did you arrive in England? 4 months ago. And you never thought to inform anyone? There were search parties, Princess. Your disappearance caused an international incident. Celeste turned back to Thomas, whose breathing had indeed eased, whose color was returning. She adjusted his blanket with shaking hands. I sent a letter to my aunt in Vienna. She knows I'm safe. Beyond that, the world's concern is unwarranted. I am exactly where I chose to be. In a servant's cottage? Ruining your hands with labor. He moved closer, and she caught the scent of rain and leather, and something darker. Whiskey, perhaps, or simply the storm he carried with him. This is not choice, Princess. This is desperation. She whirled on him then, 2 years of suppressed rage and grief finally breaking through. And what would you have me do, Your Grace? Return to a court that no longer exists? Beg charity from relatives who turned away when my father's debts were revealed? Marry you out of necessity when I refused you out of principle? The words hung between them like a blade. Alexander's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Hurt, perhaps? Or memory? I did not come here to renew my suit, if that's your concern. Then why did you come? Because my cousin wrote that his new governess was unusually educated, spoke 5 languages, and had a habit of singing French lullabies to his daughters. Because he mentioned, in passing, that she bore a striking resemblance to a portrait he'd once seen at Versailles. He paused. Because I wanted to see if the woman who humiliated me had found her happiness in obscurity. Celeste's breath caught. And have you satisfied your curiosity? What I've found, he said quietly, is a woman who sacrificed everything for pride, tending to a servant's child as if he were a prince. What I've found is complicated. Before she could respond, a small voice interrupted them. Princess? They both turned. Thomas was awake, his brown eyes huge in his pale face. He was looking at Celeste with such trust, such simple affection, that her heart contracted. I'm here, darling. She knelt beside him again, taking his small hand in hers. Your fever's broken. You're going to be well. Will you stay? He asked, his words slightly slurred with exhaustion. Will you stay and tell me another story about the dragons? Celeste felt tears prick her eyes. She'd told him stories every evening, fantastical tales from her childhood, when her mother was alive and the world seemed full of magic. She'd never imagined how much she'd needed to tell those stories, to remember who she'd been before duty and disappointment had hardened her. I'll stay, she promised. Good. Thomas's gaze drifted to Alexander, curious but unafraid. Who's the tall man? Before Celeste could answer, Alexander stepped forward. He removed his greatcoat and knelt on the other side of the narrow bed, his expression softening in a way she'd never seen before. I'm a friend, he said simply, and I'm very glad you're feeling better. Are you a prince? Thomas asked. You look like one from the stories. I'm a duke. It's almost the same thing. Is Princess Celeste your princess? The question was innocent, childish, but it struck like lightning. Celeste opened her mouth to deny it, to explain, but Alexander spoke first. His eyes never left hers as he said, with quiet finality, She's not going anywhere. The words reverberated through the small cottage, a vow and a challenge and a promise all at once. Celeste's heart hammered against her ribs. She wanted to protest, to assert her independence, to remind him that she'd chosen this life freely. But looking at him across Thomas's bed, seeing the determination in his face and the gentleness in his hands as he adjusted the boy's blanket, she found herself wordless. Sleep now, Alexander told Thomas. The princess and I will keep watch. The boy's eyes were already drifting closed, comforted by their presence. Within moments, he was breathing deeply, peacefully. The fever had truly passed. Celeste stood slowly, her legs stiff from kneeling. She moved to the cottage's tiny hearth, where a kettle hung over dying embers. She needed to do something with her hands to avoid looking at the Duke who just upended her carefully constructed refuge. "You cannot simply declare I'm staying," she said, her voice low so as not to wake Thomas. "You have no authority over me." "I have every authority." Alexander rose to his full height, and in the flickering firelight, he looked like something from her dragon stories, powerful and dangerous and strangely beautiful. "This estate belongs to my family. You are employed by my cousin, and, whether you acknowledge it or not, you are a princess of royal blood, unprotected and unguarded in a world that would destroy you if your true identity were known. No one knows who I am. I found you in 4 months, Celeste. What makes you think others haven't? What makes you think there aren't men far less honorable than I who would see opportunity in your vulnerability?" She turned to face him, anger flashing. "Do not presume to frighten me into compliance, Your Grace. I have lived through worse than vague threats." "Have you?" He closed the distance between them in 2 strides. "Have you lived through being hunted for ransom, blackmailed for your secrets, forced into a marriage that would make your previous engagement look like paradise?" His voice was hard now, urgent. "You refused me once, Princess. I accepted that refusal with whatever grace I could muster, but I will not stand by and watch you destroy yourself out of stubborn pride." "This isn't pride!" The words burst from her, too loud. She forced herself to whisper, conscious of Thomas sleeping nearby. "This is survival. This is finding meaning in a life that was taken from me. I am useful here. I matter to those children. I matter to—" She gestured helplessly at Thomas. "To him. Can you understand that? For the first time in my life, I am valued for what I give, not for what I represent." Something in Alexander's expression shifted. The hardness softened into something that looked almost like understanding. "I do understand," he said quietly, "more than you might think." "How could you possibly?" "Because I spent my entire childhood being groomed to be exactly what you're running from." He moved to the window, staring out at the storm-lashed darkness. "A title, a legacy, a piece on someone else's chessboard. When you refused me at the Crystal Palace, do you know what I felt?" She shook her head, unable to speak. "Relief." He turned back to her, and in his eyes she saw a complexity she'd never allowed herself to notice before. For one moment, someone had chosen something other than duty. You'd chosen authenticity over advantage. It was humiliating, yes. My pride was wounded, but part of me envied your courage. Celeste felt the world tilting beneath her feet. "You envied me? You walked away from everything. I've never had that choice." He smiled, but it was edged with bitterness. "Even now, I'm trapped by obligation. My mother expects me to marry and produce an heir. My estates require constant attention. I sit in Parliament and vote on laws that affect thousands of lives, and I wonder if any of it matters. If I matter beyond my name." Alexander. His given name slipped out before she could stop it. Intimate and dangerous. "Your Grace, I mean." "Alexander is fine. We're well past formality, don't you think?" He moved closer again, and this time she didn't retreat. "I'm not here to drag you back to a life you've rejected, Celeste. I'm here to offer you something different." Her pulse quickened. "What do you mean?" "Stay at Ashbourne Hall, as my guest, not my cousin's governess, under your true name, with the protection my title affords." He held up a hand to forestall her protest. "Not as my betrothed, as someone under my guardianship, until you decide what you truly want. Give yourself time to grieve, to heal, without having to pretend to be someone you're not." It was a generous offer. Too generous. Celeste studied his face, searching for the trap, the hidden price. "Why would you do this? After what I did to you? Because that boy just asked if you would stay, and you promised him you would. Because I can see what this pretense is costing you, even if you can't." Alexander's voice dropped, becoming almost tender. "And because, perhaps, I want the chance to know the real Celeste Marguerite, not the princess who performed for crowds, or the governess who hides from the world. Just you." The sincerity in his words pierced through every defense she'd built. Celeste felt tears sliding down her cheeks before she realized she was crying. Not the delicate tears of a princess, but deep, wrenching sobs that came from somewhere she'd kept locked away for months, since her father's death, since the dissolution of her engagement, since the moment she'd realized she was truly, utterly alone. Strong arms enfolded her, and she found herself against Alexander's chest, his hand cradling the back of her head as she wept. He said nothing, offered no platitudes, simply held her as the storm raged outside and her careful composure finally completely shattered. "I'm so tired," she whispered against his jacket. "I'm so tired of being strong." "Then rest," he murmured into her hair. "Let me be strong for both of us." It wasn't a declaration of love. It wasn't even a promise of romance. But it was real and honest, and in that moment, it was exactly what she needed. When her tears finally subsided, Celeste pulled back, embarrassed by her outburst. But Alexander's expression held no judgment, only concern. "You'll need to tell your cousin," he said practically. "He deserves to know the truth. He'll dismiss me. He'll understand. Edmund is a good man, and he has 6 daughters of his own. He'll want you protected." Alexander glanced at Thomas, still sleeping peacefully. "The boy will be cared for. I'll see to it personally." "You would do that?" "I would do that." Celeste nodded slowly, feeling the weight of her false identity lifting even as a new uncertainty settled in its place. "And if I accept your offer, what then? What happens when society learns that the disgraced Princess of Valmont is living under your roof?" Alexander's smile was wry. "Then society will gossip, as it always does. Let them. I've weathered scandals before. Not like this." "Perhaps not, but I find I'm less concerned with propriety than I once was." He offered her his hand, formal despite everything that had passed between them. "Will you come to Ashbourne Hall, Princess? Will you give us both a chance to discover who we might be without the weight of the world's expectations?" Celeste looked down at his extended hand. Strong, capable, with the calluses of a man who rode and worked despite his privilege. Honest hands. Behind her, Thomas stirred in his sleep, murmuring her name. He would be cared for. Alexander had promised. The other children she taught would find a new governess. Life would continue, as it always did. But her life, her real life, not the performance she'd been giving since birth, might finally begin. She placed her hand in his. "I'll come." His fingers closed around hers, warm and sure. "Then let's get you out of this storm." Ashbourne Hall rose from the Yorkshire moors like something from a Gothic tale, all gray stone and mullioned windows, surrounded by ancient oaks that seemed to guard its secrets. Celeste arrived 3 days after that night in the cottage, traveling in Alexander's coach with 2 of his most trusted servants. The rain had cleared, leaving the landscape washed clean and impossibly green. Shed said her goodbyes to Edmund's family, explaining with Alexander's help that circumstances required her to leave. The baronet had been understanding, even kind, pressing a small purse of coins into her hand despite her protests. The children had cried, especially little Anne, who'd clung to her skirts and begged her to write. Thomas, recovered and bright-eyed, had given her a slightly crumpled wildflower. "For luck," he'd said solemnly, "like the princess in your stories." She'd tucked it into her journal, the only possession from her former life she'd kept. Now, standing before Ashbourne Hall, Celeste felt her courage waver. The house was magnificent, far grander than Edmund's modest estate. This was old power, old money, the kind of establishment that had weathered centuries and would weather centuries more. She was a princess without a principality, a woman without a clear place in the world's order. What was she doing here? Second thoughts? Alexander appeared beside her, having dismounted from his horse. He'd ridden ahead to alert his staff of her arrival. Third or fourth thoughts, more likely, she tried to smile. It's very grand. It's very empty. He said it matter-of-factly, without self-pity. My parents died when I was 19. My sister married and moved to Scotland. Most of the rooms haven't been opened in years. He offered his arm. Perhaps a guest will remind it how to feel like a home. They entered through massive oak doors into an entrance hall that took her breath away. The ceiling soared 2 stories high, painted with classical frescoes. A grand staircase curved upward, its banister carved with intricate detail. Portraits lined the walls, generations of Graysons watching the latest addition to their domain. A woman in her 50s appeared, dressed in the black bombazine of a housekeeper. Her face was kind but curious. "Mrs. Hastings, this is Her Highness Princess Celeste Marguerite of Valmont. She'll be staying with us indefinitely." Alexander's tone brooked no questioning. "She's to be treated with every courtesy and given the blue suite in the East Wing." Mrs. Hastings' eyes widened, but she curtsied smoothly. "Of course, Your Grace. Welcome to Ashbourne Hall, Your Highness." "Please, just Celeste is fine," she said quickly, uncomfortable with the formality. "I'm grateful for your hospitality." "I'll show you to your rooms," Mrs. Hastings said warmly. "I'm sure you'd like to rest after your journey." As Celeste followed the housekeeper up the grand staircase, she glanced back at Alexander. He stood in the entrance hall, hands clasped behind his back, watching her ascent. The afternoon light streamed through the windows, illuminating him in gold. For a moment, he looked less like a duke and more like a man carrying a burden he'd never asked for. Their eyes met, and he nodded once, a gesture of reassurance or perhaps acknowledgement of the strangeness of their arrangement. Then she turned and continued upward, into the unknown. The blue suite was exquisite, a bedroom, sitting room, and private dressing room decorated in shades of sapphire and cream. French windows opened onto a balcony overlooking the estate's gardens, where roses bloomed in riotous profusion. A writing desk held fresh paper and ink. The wardrobe was already stocked with gowns in her size, though how Alexander had managed that, she couldn't fathom. "His Grace had his mother's dressmaker come from London," Mrs. Hastings explained, reading her thoughts. "He wanted you to have proper attire. The Duchess was similar in stature to yourself, Your Highness." Celeste ran her hand over a gown of pale green silk, beautifully made, but slightly outdated in style. These had been his mother's clothes, carefully preserved, had given her his mother's rooms, his mother's wardrobe. It was either deeply meaningful or simply practical. She wasn't sure which unsettled her more. "Dinner is at 8, Mrs. Hastings continued. "His Grace usually dines in the small parlor when he's alone. Shall I tell him you'll join him?" The thought of sitting across from Alexander, just the two of them, was both terrifying and intriguing. "Yes, thank you." When the housekeeper left, Celeste moved to the balcony. The view was spectacular. Manicured gardens giving way to wilderness, the moors stretching toward a horizon painted in amber and rose. So different from the palace gardens of her childhood, with their geometric precision and constant pruning. This was wild and honest, and somehow more beautiful for its imperfections. She thought of Thomas's question, "Will you stay?" She'd promised she would, though she hadn't specified where. Now here she was, in a duke's house, wearing a dead duchess's gown, about to have dinner with a man she'd publicly humiliated. Her life had become a story she couldn't have imagined writing. but for the first time in months, she felt something like hope. Dinner was surprisingly intimate. The small parlor was exactly that, small by ducal standards. A table set for two, lit by candelabra. A fire crackled in the hearth despite the mild evening. Alexander rose when she entered, his eyes appreciating the green gown she'd chosen. "You look beautiful," he said simply. "Your mother had excellent taste." She did. He held her chair, a gesture so courtly it reminded her of her former life. "She would have liked you, I think." "Even after I humiliated her son?" "Especially then." Alexander took his seat across from her as servants brought the first course, a delicate soup with herbs from the estate garden. She had little patience for meaningless convention. "She once told me that if I ever met a woman brave enough to refuse me, I should probably reconsider my proposal." Celeste nearly choked on her wine. "She said that?" "In slightly more diplomatic terms, yes." His smile was genuine, transforming his usually severe features. "My mother believed in matching minds and hearts, not just titles and fortunes. She would have approved of your honesty, even if the method caused me some discomfort." Some discomfort? That's diplomatic. Celeste felt herself relaxing slightly. "I believe the Times called it the most spectacular rejection in modern history. The Chronicle went with a lesson in humility for the aristocracy. My personal favorite was the political cartoon showing me on bended knee while you rode away on a white horse. I saw that one. You were drawn rather handsomely." Small mercies. He leaned back, studying her over the candlelight. "May I ask you something I've wondered about for 2 years?" Her heart skipped. "Ask. Why the Crystal Palace? If you intended to refuse me, why wait until the most public moment possible?" It was the question she'd known would come eventually. Celeste set down her spoon, gathering her thoughts. "Because I didn't intend to refuse you." Alexander's expression sharpened. "What?" "I went to that dinner planning to accept your proposal. My father had arranged everything. The announcement would secure his debts, cement alliances, give me the security every princess is raised to seek." She met his eyes, needing him to understand. "But then your cousin Edmund," yes, the same Edmund, "made a toast. He spoke about love matches and how rare they were in our circles, how most couples tolerated each other while living separately." "I remember," Alexander said. "In that moment, I realized what my life would become. Years of tolerating each other while living separately, children raised by nurses while we attended different social functions. Growing old without ever truly knowing the person I'd bound my life to." Her voice dropped. "I couldn't do it, not to you and not to myself. So when you knelt before 300 guests and asked me to be your wife, I chose honesty over security. I chose the possibility of something real over the certainty of something hollow." The silence that followed was profound. Alexander didn't move, but something in his expression cracked open, revealing hurt and understanding in equal measure. "You could have told me privately," he finally said. "I could have, but then the pressure would have continued. My father would have negotiated, diplomats would have intervened. The only way to make it final, to make it impossible to reverse, was to refuse you as publicly as you'd proposed." She smiled sadly. "I made sure we both escaped that trap, Your Grace. I'm not certain you've forgiven me for that." "Alexander," he corrected. "And you're right, I haven't forgiven you." He paused, letting the words land before continuing. "Because there's nothing to forgive. You saved us both from a mistake disguised as duty." Celeste felt tears threatening again, but these were different. Not grief, but release. "Then why did you seem so angry that night at the cottage?" "Because I was angry, not at your refusal, but at what came after." He leaned forward, intensity burning in his gray eyes. "You disappeared, Celeste. You could have come to me, could have asked for help when your world collapsed. Instead, you chose to scrub floors and teach ungrateful children and pretend to be someone common, as if your life had no value beyond what service you could provide. My life had no value beyond that, she protested. I was a princess of a dunked principality, a woman with no fortune and no prospects. What else was I supposed to? You were supposed to remember that you're brilliant and educated and brave enough to refuse a duke in front of hundreds of witnesses. His voice rose with passion. You were supposed to remember that you speak 5 languages, that you've negotiated treaties, that you have the kind of mind and spirit that most people only dream of possessing. You were supposed to refuse to be diminished by circumstances. The words hung between them, fierce and oddly tender. Is that why you brought me here? Celeste asked. To remind me of my value? I brought you here because the world is cruel to women without protection, and I had protection to offer. Because I couldn't stand the thought of you suffering when I had the means to prevent it. He reached across the table, stopping just short of touching her hand. And yes, because I hoped you'd remember that you're extraordinary, not despite your choices, but because of them. Celeste looked at his hand, so close to hers. She thought about the Crystal Palace, about Thomas's cottage, about all the paths that had led her to this moment. Then she closed the distance, placing her hand over his. His fingers immediately curled around hers, warm and sure. "Thank you," she whispered, "for seeing me when I'd forgotten how to see myself." "Always," he promised. It wasn't a declaration of love, but it felt like the beginning of something that might become love, given time and honesty and the courage to keep choosing each other. The soup grew cold as they talked into the night, 2 people learning to be real with each other for the first time. The next weeks fell into a rhythm that surprised them both with its ease. Celeste slept late, unbound by governess duties. She spent her mornings in the library, a magnificent room filled with books in multiple languages, where she could finally read for pleasure rather than instruction. She walked the gardens, rode the estate horses, and slowly remembered what it felt like to live rather than merely survive. Alexander conducted his business in the mornings, managing the vast network of estates and investments that comprised his duchy. But afternoons found them together more often than not, riding across the moors, discussing philosophy over tea, or simply sitting in companionable silence in the drawing room. They didn't speak of romance or the future. Instead, they built something more valuable: friendship. "Tell me about your mother," Celeste said one afternoon as they walked through the portrait gallery. They'd stopped before a painting of a woman with kind eyes and Alexander's strong jaw. The Duchess of Ashbourne at 30, the plaque read, Marie Antoinette Grayson. "She was French," Alexander said, smiling at the memory, "from an old Provençal family. My father met her in Paris during the Congress and fell so violently in love that he proposed after 2 weeks. She said yes, even though it meant leaving everything she knew." "Was she happy here?" "She made happiness here. There's a difference." He gestured toward the gardens visible through the gallery windows. "She designed those roses. She turned the East Wing into a sanctuary for local families in need. There's still a school and a clinic there, open to anyone from the surrounding villages. She believed that privilege was responsibility, not just pleasure." "You miss her." "Every day." His voice roughened. "She died of pneumonia when I was 19. My father followed 6 months later. A heart attack, the doctor said, but I think it was a broken heart. They'd been genuinely in love, you see. The kind of love Edmund toasted that night at the Crystal Palace. The kind neither of them could survive without." Celeste understood then why her public refusal had cut so deeply. She'd rejected not just him, but the possibility of what his parents had shared. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "Don't be. You were honest about what we didn't have. I've come to appreciate that honesty." He turned from the portrait to face her. "My parents' love was beautiful and rare. but it was also built on knowing each other first. They had time to become friends before they became spouses. We never had that chance. And now? Now we're taking the time they didn't give us before. He smiled, and it reached his eyes in a way she'd never seen during their courtship. Now we're becoming friends. Everything else can wait. It should have been disappointing, this absence of romantic pressure, this focus on friendship over passion. Instead, Celeste felt relief. For the first time in her life, she was being valued for who she was rather than what she represented. There were no negotiations, no political calculations, just two people learning each other honestly. It was, she realized, the most romantic thing that had ever happened to her. But peace, as always, was temporary. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by special courier. Celeste was in the library when Mrs. Hastings found her, the housekeeper's face troubled. "Your Highness, there's a gentleman here to see you. He says it's urgent." Celeste's stomach dropped. "Who is it?" "He gave his name as Baron Rothschild. He says he's your father's former financial advisor." Friedrich Rothschild. Celeste hadn't heard that name in months, hadn't wanted to hear it. He'd been the one to inform her of her father's debts, of the principality's dissolution, of her engagement's termination. He'd been efficient and cold and utterly unforgiving. What could he possibly want now? She found him in the drawing room, examining the Grayson family portraits with an appraiser's eye. He was 60, silver-haired, dressed impeccably in London tailoring. When he turned at her entrance, his expression was calculating. "Your Highness, or should I say, Miss Marguerite, I understand you've been living under an assumed name." "Baron Rothschild." Celeste kept her voice level. "This is unexpected." "I imagine it is. You've been quite difficult to locate." He gestured toward the settee. "Shall we sit? This conversation may take some time." Before Celeste could respond, Alexander appeared in the doorway. He must have been alerted by the servants. His presence was immediately commanding, protective. "Baron Rothschild," he said coolly, "I don't believe we've met. Duke of Ashbourne. Your reputation precedes you." Rothschild's smile didn't reach his eyes. "I'm here on a matter of some delicacy concerning the princess." "Then you may address it in my presence," Alexander said, moving to stand beside Celeste. "Her Highness is under my protection." How modern. Rothschild's tone suggested he found it anything but. "Very well. Your Highness, I come with news regarding your father's estate." Celeste's hands clenched. "I was told there was no estate, that everything was sold to cover his debts." "Most of it was. However, certain complications have arisen." Rothschild withdrew a document from his case. "Your father had a secondary set of investments, kept separate from his public holdings. Upon his death, these were frozen pending the resolution of certain legal matters. Those matters have now been resolved." "What kind of investments?" "Properties in Switzerland, mining interests in South Africa, shares in various American railroad ventures. Conservative investments made years before the gambling began." He slid the document across the table. "The total value, after all legal fees and tax obligations, comes to approximately £200,000. The number was staggering. Not a fortune by royal standards, but enough to restore her independence, to live comfortably anywhere in the world. Celeste stared at the document, her mind reeling. "There must be some condition," Alexander said, his voice suspicious. "Astute, Your Grace." Rothschild's smile sharpened. "The investments were placed in trust for the princess until her 25th birthday or her marriage to an approved candidate. Her Highness is currently 24. The trustees, of which I am one, must approve any early access to the funds." "And what would constitute approval?" Celeste asked, though she already knew. "A suitable marriage, to a man of appropriate rank and financial standing. Rothschild's gaze shifted meaningfully to Alexander. I understand you were previously engaged to the Duke here. If such an arrangement could be reinstated, the trustees would view that quite favorably. The trap snapped shut with elegant precision. Celeste stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. I will not be blackmailed into marriage for money that's rightfully mine. It's not blackmail, Your Highness. It's simply the terms of your father's trust. He wanted to ensure you were properly settled before accessing significant funds. Rothschild remained seated, unbothered by her anger. Of course, you could wait until your 25th birthday. That's only 8 months away. Or you could marry the Duke, who was your father's preferred choice from the beginning, and gain immediate access. Get out! Celeste's voice shook with rage. Get out of this house! Your Highness. You heard the princess, Alexander said, his tone deadly quiet. Leave, now. Rothschild stood, gathering his documents with unhurried precision. I'll leave the papers here for your review. Take a week to consider. But I should mention, the trustees are prepared to contest your claim to any funds if you remain uncooperative. Your father's gambling debts created numerous creditors. Without our protection, they could tie up the estate in legal proceedings for years. He left with a small bow, the threat hanging in the air like poison. The moment the door closed, Celeste collapsed back into her chair, shaking. All the independence she'd fought for, all the choices she'd made to escape being a bargaining chip, rendered meaningless by her father's final manipulation. Celeste, Alexander knelt before her, taking her cold hands in his. Look at me. She met his eyes, hers burning with unshed tears. He planned this. Even in death, my father tried to control me. Or he tried to protect you in the only way he understood. Alexander's voice was gentle. The trust isn't malicious, even if Rothschild's delivery was. Your father wanted you secure. He wanted me married to you. That was always his primary goal. The bitterness in her voice surprised even her. This whole arrangement, you offering me refuge, me learning to trust you, was it all predestined? Am I just following the path my father laid out, thinking I'm making my own choices? No. Alexander's grip tightened. You chose to refuse me when every pressure demanded you accept. You chose to survive alone rather than trade yourself for security. You chose to come here as a friend, not a fiancé. Those were your choices, Celeste, no one else's. But now I have to choose again. Marry you for money? Or wait 8 months and hope Rothschild doesn't destroy my claim out of spite? Or, Alexander said slowly, you choose a third option. What third option? He rose, pacing to the window. Marry me for a reason that has nothing to do with money or your father's trust. Celeste's heart stopped. Alexander, hear me out. He turned to face her, and his expression was completely serious. These past weeks have shown me something I didn't understand 2 years ago. I like you, Celeste. Not the princess, not the title, not the idea of you. The actual woman who tells stories to sick children and argues philosophy in the library and laughs at my terrible jokes. I enjoy your company. I respect your mind. I admire your courage. That's not love, she whispered. No, it's not yet. But it's the foundation love is built on, the kind of love my parents had. Friendship first, passion later, built on knowing each other truly. He crossed to her, dropping to one knee, as he had in the Crystal Palace. But this time his eyes were clear, honest. Marry me, Celeste, not because your father wanted it, or because the trust demands it. Marry me, because we're building something real here, something that could become extraordinary if we give it time and commitment. And if it doesn't become love? Her voice broke on the question. If we're just friends playing at marriage? Then we're friends who honor our vows and build a life of mutual respect. That's more than most marriages have." He smiled sadly. "I know I'm asking you to gamble. I know this isn't the romance novel's promise. But I'm offering you partnership, freedom to be yourself, and the protection of my name without demanding you become someone you're not. Is that enough?" Celeste looked at him. This man who'd found her in the mud and never once suggested she should be anywhere else, who'd given her his mother's rooms and asked for nothing in return, who'd spent weeks simply being her friend. She thought about Thomas, asking, "Will you stay?" and Alexander answering, "She's not going anywhere." He'd meant it then, she realized. Even before Rothschild's ultimatum, even without financial incentive, Alexander had meant those words. "Ask me properly," she said. "What?" "If you're going to propose, do it properly, not as a transaction or a solution to a problem. Ask me like you mean it." Alexander's face transformed, hope dawning like sunrise. He took her hand, his thumb stroking across her knuckles. "Celeste Marguerite, Princess of Valmont, woman of courage and wit and stubborn pride, will you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife, not because anyone expects it, but because I genuinely want to spend my life learning to love you properly?" It wasn't the most polished proposal. It was honest and uncertain and wonderfully, terrifyingly real. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I'll marry you." He stood, pulling her up with him, and for a moment they simply looked at each other. Two people standing at the precipice of something that might be wonderful or disastrous, or both. Then he kissed her. It was gentle and questioning, a kiss between friends becoming something more. When they parted, both were smiling. "We're either very wise or very foolish," Celeste said. "Perhaps both." Alexander kept her hand in his. "But well, be wise or foolish together." It wasn't a fairy tale ending. It was a beginning, honest and hopeful and entirely their own. The wedding took place 6 weeks later in the Ashbourne Estate Chapel, a small stone building that had witnessed Grayson marriages for 300 years. It was nothing like the grand affair the Crystal Palace proposal had promised. No kings or ambassadors, no elaborate ceremony. Just Alexander's family, a few close friends, and the estate staff who'd come to care for their unusual princess. Edmund and his family attended, little Thomas serving as a surprisingly solemn ring-bearer. Mrs. Hastings wept openly. Even Rothschild appeared, watching with his calculating gaze as the trust's conditions were fulfilled. But Celeste barely noticed any of them. She stood before Alexander in a gown of ivory silk, not his mother's, but one chosen for herself, and spoke vows that felt more like promises between friends than legal obligations. "I promise to be honest with you, even when honesty is difficult," she said. "I promise to value your mind as much as your title. I promise to keep choosing you, freely, for as long as we both shall live." Alexander's voice was steady as he replied, "I promise to protect your freedom as fiercely as your safety. I promise to see you clearly, not through the lens of what society expects. I promise to earn your love every day, for as long as we both shall live." When the vicar pronounced them married, Alexander kissed her with careful reverence, as if she were something precious he was only beginning to understand. The wedding breakfast was held in Ashbourne Hall's great dining room, the table groaning with food prepared by an excited kitchen staff. Champagne flowed, toasts were made, and gradually the formality dissolved into genuine celebration. "Speech!" called out, slightly drunk. "The groom must make a speech." Alexander stood, raising his glass. "I'm not known for eloquence," he began, "but I'll attempt to say what's in my heart. He looked down at Celeste, his gray eyes warm. 2 years ago, a woman taught me that honesty matters more than convenience. Today, that same woman has given me the chance to build something real rather than something expected. To my wife, may we spend our lives surprising each other with who we're capable of becoming. The guests applauded. Celeste felt tears on her cheeks, but they were happy tears, the kind she hadn't cried in years. As the afternoon wore into evening and guests began to depart, Celeste found herself on the terrace, watching the sun paint the moors in shades of gold and amber. She heard Alexander's footsteps behind her, but didn't turn. "Regrets?" he asked quietly. "None." She leaned back against him as his arms came around her waist. "Uncertainties, yes, but no regrets." "Good, because I should tell you something." "What?" "I sent a letter to Rothschild this morning, before the ceremony, instructing him to freeze the trust funds indefinitely." Celeste turned in his arms, shocked. "What? Why?" "Because I don't want you to ever wonder if this marriage was about money. The trust can sit untouched until your 25th birthday, or forever, for all I care." He cupped her face gently. "I married you for you, Celeste, nothing else." She kissed him then, deeply, her hands tangling in his hair. When they parted, both were breathless. "You're either a romantic fool or the best man I've ever known," she said. "Again, perhaps both." He smiled against her lips. "Come to bed, wife. Trying to seduce me already, husband? Every day for the rest of our lives, if you'll let me." She took his hand, letting him lead her back into Ashbourne Hall. Their home now, their future, their choice. 3 months after the wedding, Celeste stood in what had once been the Duchess' parlor, now converted into a schoolroom. A dozen children from the estate and surrounding villages sat at desks, listening as she taught them French grammar. Alexander had given her free rein to continue his mother's educational initiatives, and she'd thrown herself into the work with passion. This wasn't being a governess out of desperation. This was choosing to be useful because usefulness brought her joy. "Excellent, Mary," she praised, a tenant farmer's daughter who'd correctly conjugated a difficult verb. "You have a gift for languages." The door opened and Alexander appeared, slightly dusty from riding. He'd been surveying the northern fields, dealing with drainage issues. Their eyes met across the classroom, and he smiled, that private smile he reserved only for her. "Don't let me interrupt," he said. But the children had already noticed. "Your Grace," they chorused. "Continue your lessons," he instructed, his ducal authority clear. Then, to Celeste, "When you're finished, I have something to show you." Curiosity piqued, she completed the lesson with record speed. When the children were dismissed and the room empty, she turned to her husband. "What is it?" "Come with me." He led her not into the main house, but toward the estate's east wing, where his mother's clinic and charity school still operated. But instead of entering those familiar rooms, he guided her to a locked door she'd never seen opened. "My mother's studio," he explained, producing a key. "I haven't been in here since she died. I wasn't ready. And now? Now I think she'd want you to have it." The door swung open, revealing a sun-drenched room filled with easels, paints, half-finished canvases. Marie Antoinette Grayson had been an artist, Celeste realized, her throat tight with emotion. Not just a duchess, but a creator. "She painted constantly," Alexander said softly. "Portraits, landscapes, anything that caught her eye. My father used to joke that he'd married an artist who occasionally played at being nobility, not the other way around." Celeste moved through the space reverently, examining the canvases. They were good, actually good, not just the dabbling of a bored aristocrat. There was skill and vision and genuine talent. "Why are you showing me this?" she asked. "Because you were a princess who occasionally played at being royal. Because I think you're still discovering who you are beneath the title and the expectations." He came to stand beside her. "Because this room has been locked too long, and so have you. Maybe it's time for both of you to open again." Celeste looked at her husband, this man who kept seeing her more clearly than she saw herself. "I don't know if I have any artistic talent." "Then discover it, or discover something else. Write, paint, teach, build something entirely your own." His hand found hers. "You're the Duchess of Ashbourne now, Celeste. That comes with responsibilities, yes, but also with resources and freedom. Use them. Become whoever you're meant to be." She kissed him, pouring gratitude and affection and something that was beginning to feel a lot like love into the gesture. When they parted, she said, "You're earning that promise, you know, about earning my love every day." "Good." He kissed her forehead. "Because you're earning mine, too." They stood together in the dusty studio, sunlight streaming through windows that hadn't been opened in over a decade, and Celeste felt something inside her unlock. Not just a room, but possibility. Not just a marriage, but partnership. She'd been a princess who refused a duke, a governess who hid from her past, and now a duchess learning to build her future. Each transformation had been necessary. Each choice had led her here. And here, she realized, was exactly where she'd always needed to be. 2 years after that converted wedding, on a spring morning brilliant with promise, Celeste walked through Ashbourne's gardens with a small hand in hers. Edward James Grayson, 8 months old, gurgled happily as he toddled on unsteady legs, stopping to examine every flower and bug with fierce concentration. "He has your curiosity," Alexander said from behind them, carrying their picnic basket. "And your stubbornness." Celeste scooped up her son as he tried to eat a dandelion. "No, darling, we look at flowers, we don't taste them." Edward responded by laughing and grabbing her nose. They settled on a blanket under the old oak where Alexander had first told her about his mother's roses. The estate stretched before them, prosperous and peaceful. The school Celeste had established now educated 50 children. The clinic served 300 families. The land produced enough to support everyone who depended on it. And their marriage, built on friendship, honesty, and the courage to choose each other daily, had become the kind of love Alexander's parents would have recognized. "I received a letter from Edmund today," Alexander said, unpacking sandwiches. "Thomas is doing well. He's apprenticed to the estate steward, learning management. He wants to know when we're visiting." "Thomas?" Celeste smiled, remembering the fevered boy who'd asked her to stay. "Tell Edmund we'll come next month. I'd like Edward to meet him." "The boy who helped save you?" "The boy who reminded me why I wanted to be saved." She looked at her husband, her friend, her partner. "You know, I never thanked you properly." "For what?" "For answering him that night. For saying I wasn't going anywhere." She shifted Edward to her other hip. "You could have let me fade into obscurity. Instead, you gave me the chance to become someone I'm proud of being." Alexander set aside the basket and cupped her face with both hands. "You were already someone worth being proud of, Celeste. I just gave you a safe place to remember it." He kissed her, long and sweet, while Edward squirmed between them and giggled. When they parted, Celeste leaned her head against Alexander's shoulder. Their son nestled between them, the spring sun warm on their faces. This wasn't the life her father had imagined for her. It wasn't the fairy tale the world expected. It was better. It was real. A small voice echoed in her memory. "Will you stay, princess?" And she realized she'd been answering that question every day for 2 years, in 1,000 small choices that added up to one truth. She'd stayed not because she had to, but because she found a place worth staying for. and a person worth staying with. "Alexander," she said quietly. "Hmm? I love you." She felt him smile against her hair. "I know. I love you too." Edward squealed and clapped as if applauding their declaration. They laughed, this small family that had formed itself from refusal and redemption, from honesty and hope. And in the gardens of Ashbourne Hall, under the oak tree where generations of Graysons had made their promises, they held each other and their son, and the future they were building together, one choice, one day, one love at a time.